All right, greetings all. Thanks so much for being with us. Welcome to this online panel, Turkey in the Aftermath of the 2023 Elections. And this is a follow-up to our May event on the topic that took place before the runoff vote. And I'm Mimi Kirk. I'm program manager for the MESA Global Academy, which is an initiative of the Middle East Studies Association and the City University of New York Graduate Center that supports displaced scholars from the Middle East and North Africa who are currently in North America. This panel is co-hosted by the Global Academy and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, and Professor Asli Bali of Yale Law School will serve as moderator. Professor Bali is also the chair of the Global Academy Committee and is president-elect of the Middle East Studies Association. Okay, Asli, you have the floor. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mimi, and thanks to our co-sponsors. I am delighted to be moderating this panel on Turkey in the aftermath of the 2023 elections. Turkey held national elections in the month of May that have set the course of the country's political trajectory for the next 5 years. Parliamentary elections yielded a more right-leaning parliament than the country has had in a long time. Presidential elections, which were held in 2 rounds, brought Recep Tayyip Erdogan back to power for his 3rd presidential term and another 5 years in office, following on 20 years in which he has presided over the country, first as prime minister and then as president. We last convened this panel between the 1st and 2nd rounds of the presidential election to digest the outcome of the May 14th elections for parliament and to discuss possible scenarios in the May 28th presidential runoff. We are now gathered again to provide an analysis of the elections as a whole and their implications from a variety of perspectives. We're intervening at a time when the range of debates about interpreting the results in Turkey has been very broad. For those directly involved in party politics within the country, there have been a spectrum of responses. In the opposition, both the so-called Table of Six opposition coalition and the Kurdish and Labor opposition coalition have taken this, at least some of their party members have taken this as a time of self-criticism, introspection, and debates about new directions and new leadership. But there are others in the country, amongst the political parties and amongst analysts, that have already begun looking forward to next spring's municipal elections, continuing apace as if it's possible to just keep moving without offering any account of either missed opportunities or lessons learned from the May elections. On their part, the AKP coalition and Erdogan appear to be moving on course in the same direction that they've taken to date, experiencing the elections as an endorsement of their politics and their approach. For analysts, responses have been more varied, including those who have been giving searing critiques of the opposition's alleged incompetence, to those who have argued equally passionately that under authoritarian conditions, elections cannot and should not ever be treated as truly competitive, to those who worry that this may actually be the last time in the lifetime, in the natural life of President Erdogan, that Turkey will ever witness even modestly competitive elections. So overall, everyone is asking what's next on the horizon, given particularly the general reactionary trend and chauvinist nationalism evidenced in the vote in the election and now, seated in parliament under a 3rd Erdogan presidency. There are many possible projects afoot: a new constitution, a new so-called Kurdish opening that might be designed to further demobilize and even pacify existing Kurdish resistance and the Kurdish movement as a whole in Turkey. There is much to discuss, and we could not be more fortunate to be joined once more by such a distinguished and expert panel of scholars to really offer us their views on this very wide and this very tense spectrum at this turning point moment for Turkey's coming trajectory. I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they're going to speak. Each of them will be given time to offer a short opening statement, and then we'll have 1 round of questions amongst ourselves before turning to the Q&A. So in order to keep things on time, I'll be keeping time. I'm not going to pause between speakers, apart from to invite the next speaker to take the floor. So our first speaker is going to be Selin Bengi Gumrukcu, who's a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University. She earned her PhD from the University of Zurich and is currently finalizing a manuscript titled Protests and Politics in Turkey in the 1970s, The Making of a Protest Wave for Routledge. Our second panelist will be Evren Altinkas, who's an adjunct professor in the Department of History at the University of Guelph. His research interests span the history of the Middle East politics, Turkish history, Turkish politics, and intellectual history. Our third panelist will be Nazan Bedirhanoglu. She is an assistant professor in the sociology program at Xavier University. Her research interests focus on shifting structures of the global political economy and the repercussions of these shifts for the Middle East in general and the Kurdish regions and Turkey in particular. Our fourth speaker will be Nihat Celik, who received his PhD from Kadir Has University, where his dissertation was titled The Intentions and Capabilities of Turkey as a Regional Power, a Structural Realist Analysis spanning 2002 to 2014. His research focuses on Turkish politics, diplomatic history, foreign policy analysis, and civil society, and his publications have appeared in peer-reviewed journals such as Turkish Studies and Geopolitics. Our fifth speaker on the panel will be Professor Utku Balaban, who is an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Race, Intersectionality, Gender, and Sociology at Xavier College. He specializes in urban, political, and economic sociology, and previously taught at Ankara University in Turkey until he was expelled and blacklisted by the government in 2017 for signing a statement known as the Peace Petition to protest the deadly violence by government forces against Kurdish civilians in 2015. Our final panelist will be Halal Ibrahim Yenigun, who's a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia and a MESA Global Academy Fellow. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia's Political Theory program, and his research is on Muslim political thought, Islamism, and Turkish democracy. And with that, I am now happy to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Professor Gumrukcu.
Hi, thank you everyone for organizing this and coming to our panel. I know that everyone is probably a little bit tired of discussions on Turkish elections by now, but we are happy to have you with us today. So what I will do in my talk today is to kind of summarize the campaign messages of the two broad parties that ran in the elections. When we look at it, we see that, President Erdogan's campaign was kind of like based on a more polarizing, non-inclusive message, which was built on the message that he is still the politician who can overcome the difficulties the country is facing, which are ranging from the cost of living crisis to the damage done by the earthquakes. Even though, the country has been facing this, Erdogan was portrayed as the person who can still solve all these problems, which was embodied in the campaign motto of theirs, which read as "right man at the right time." In the first round, especially, we saw that Erdogan's campaign was also based on the military-industrial complex that was built or aimed to be portrayed as being built. They underlined the statecraft, including the unmanned combat aerial vehicles, the aircraft carriers, the first helicopters, etc. But they also, build up their campaign on the message that the survival of the state was at stake, right? They kind of focused on the challenges as they perceived it caused by terror. Thus, they kind of also portrayed the opposition as terrorists, and they also underlined the challenges in the cultural aspect too, such as the challenges posed to the family as an institution by the LGBTQI groups as they perceive it again. So this was like a polarizing message, mobilizing fear and anger, and it culminated into even physical attacks to the opposition politicians even before the first round happened. On the other hand, Kılıçdaroğlu's first round campaign focused on a more inclusive strategy, which remained a little bit vague. They kind of followed this helalleşme strategy, making up with the parties in the society, which the old CHP offended. They followed an identity politics, kind of ushering, some of the identities as the Alevis in the society, but they also aimed to mobilize hope, as opposed to Erdogan's campaign, with their slogans like "the spring will come, I promise." They used, heart emojis. They used, campaign commercials with blossoming trees symbolizing spring arriving, maybe as a continuation of the radical love strategy that the party has been employing since the 2009 local elections. But on the other hand, even though, the pre-electoral coalition known as the Table of Six published a lengthy document of more than 200 pages, they are, like visible, solid alternatives to the incumbents' policies, I believe was not really well delivered to the society. So based on this, like little wrap, I would say that the first round was fought over fear and anger versus hope, as I believe both parties mobilized emotions. However, the first round's results brought a significant change in the campaign messaging, especially the opposition camp. First thing to mention here is how, like the both sides handled the situation right after the first round. While Erdogan addressed his supporters, saying that the race is not over, he boosted confidence in his grassroots, the opposition leaders, on the other hand, appeared briefly at the end of the election night, not being able to, hide their disappointment and fluster based on the results that they achieved. So second point, it appeared that the opposition side did not have a strategy, especially for the second round. Maybe, like we can say that the intra-conflicts within the table of six kind of also contributed to this. We have seen that the Istanbul mayor, İmamoğlu, tweeted that he's back at work in Istanbul municipality right after the first round. Akşener, the chair of İYİ Party, remained silent for a few days. Kılıçdaroğlu tweeted that he's going to share with his followers what has happened on the night of the first round, which has never happened so far. And then he said that we will all stand up again to win the second round, kind of very subtly accepting the defeat in the first round. On the other hand, we have seen him, like giving another message, which is delivered via a Twitter video, showing him kind of, like hitting on the table a few times, saying that I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, which felt more like a message to his party, right? His own party and his rivals in the party, rather than the electorate himself. And this was kind of like a total change from their more positive campaigning strategy that happened in the first round. So when we look at like the opposition's campaign in the second round, we are seeing that instead of mobilizing hope in the second round, they wanted to mobilize anxiety, using slogans like "those who like their homeland should come to the ballot boxes," or just saying that you need to make a decision, like karar ver. I believe that this turn was kind of like aimed to receive the votes from the national segments of the society, who voted for like a candidate like Sinan Oğan in the first round. Fourth point I can make is that for both parties, I think, like for both sides, needing to mobilize the voters was kind of like an important message. The incumbents were afraid that their voters might not go to the ballot boxes due to complacent or seasonal conditions, such as maybe, like going to the highlands to harvest their crops because of the spring and summer coming. And the opposition was afraid of declining participation due to the disappointment or despair. So before the second round, we have seen both sides kind of, like trying to mobilize their voter for a not declined turnout compared to the first round.
1 more minute.
Sure. And yeah, I think, like we can say that to wrap up, the election results can be interpreted as a discontent with the change of this campaign messaging in between the two rounds, especially by the opposition. As we know, the turnout declined by about like 2 or 3% from the first round to the second round. And also, like with regards to the mobilization of emotions, the literature shows that during electoral cycles, anger is mobilizing people more than anxiety or enthusiasm. And I think, like the incumbents did a good job, like in mobilizing that emotion. So also, like even though we do not know who were those who did not show up in the second round, about like 10 million voters, it can be assumed that it was mostly the disappointed voters of the opposition who, whose vote share in the southeast provinces of the country declined in the second round, as probably as a result of the campaign message that has shifted very significantly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Altinkas.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Bengi. That was a very good framework. I would like to speak on two main themes. One of them is what happened in the second round at the opposition side, and then I will focus on the aftermath of elections with a slight comment on the newly established cabinet. So, first of all, if you remember, I said in our first roundtable that the second round of the elections was pretty much shaped like a referendum regarding the refugees. And based on the comments and statements of Kılıçdaroğlu as the candidate running against Erdogan, in the last couple of days of the election campaign, he used the language, as Bengi said, which shifted towards nationalism and which focused on the refugees in Turkey. So this was a very critical point in the election campaign, because for most of the voters who have voted for the first time in their lives, I had a chance to have some talk with some Gen Z members after the elections. Most of them thought that this shift in the campaign of Kılıçdaroğlu, focusing on refugees only, was not giving them a hope for the future of the country, because they thought that after Kılıçdaroğlu had a meeting with Ümit Özdağ, the leader of a political party which only had almost 2% of the votes, he changed his policies according to the demands of that minority party. So, and also the presidential candidate running from that coalition, Ata İttifakı, Sinan Oğan, had already indicated that he was going to support President Erdogan in the second tour. So this pretty much shaped the result of the elections. And I believe this is one of the main reasons why the number of people Bengi just mentioned did not go and vote in the second round. So this is my interpretation of the second round of elections, but also what happened right after the end of the elections when Selahattin Demirtas has declared that he was no longer going to be an active actively in political life. This also indicates that there is going to be tremendous changes in the opposition, not only limited to Green Left Party, but also to CHP, because the executive members of CHP have all resigned, and the new members, when we look at them, we see most of them have closer ties with Ekrem İmamoğlu. So the relations between Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu have been a little bit rough since the end of elections. Their communication is not as healthy as it was during the election campaign. So I foresee a kind of political change in CHP with İmamoğlu and his followers or supporters trying to take over the political party in a very short span of time. And when we look at the new cabinet of ministers, I see a group of technocrats ruling over the country now. So, of course, there are some comments and criticisms which say that, you know, they have no experience, or they are just, you know, entourage of Erdogan. I don't believe it. I don't believe the fact that Erdogan was very effective in handpicking these ministers. Most of the ministers, most of the newly appointed ministers are appointed as a result of the voice of the voters base, or let's say the political party organization of AKP. Mehmet Şimşek is an example. Süleyman Soylu, the Minister of Interior, is no longer a minister. He is no longer in the cabinet. There were harsh reactions towards him by AKP since he became the minister. Hulusi Akar is no longer a minister. So these are important changes in the government, and which shows us that there is going to be a government of technocrats in order to recover from these economic and other crises Turkey had faced since 2018. And in addition to that, I foresee a kind of constitutional change in the future of the country. This might be one of the reasons why Süleyman Soylu and Hulusi Akar, who are both deputies, elected deputies of AKP, were not appointed as ministers, because once the deputies are appointed as ministers, they lose their right to vote in the parliament. And I believe AKP foresees that the number of right nationalist conservative deputies in the parliament, not only from AKP, but also from the tiny partners of CHP and Table of Six throughout the elections, will have a shift, or let's say tendency to vote in any kind of constitutional change drafts in favor of AKP. So they are just trying to reach to the number which is necessary to change the constitution, 360. That might be another reason why those two people are still deputies and not ministers. And this shows us that AKP and Erdogan are planning to make a step further. And we can see it in the words of Devlet Bahçeli right after the elections. He said, Turkey will, a massive change is coming. I hope Turkey will not change is a very important sentence. Most of us think that Bahçeli says things without a script, but he says all of them with a script. So, and it is also a script that was written and he said it. So I think these are important points to focus and to plan.
One more minute.
Thank you. And to think about the future of Turkish politics accordingly. I don't know what the constitution will foresee, but changes are going to happen. That's why we have a government, we have a new cabinet of ministers who are mostly focusing on security, like Hakan Fidan, like Yaşar Güler, and also Ibrahim Kalın, who has close ties with the Western countries, has now become the chair, or let's say undersecretary of the Turkish intelligence agency. These are all important points to focus on the securitization of Turkish foreign policy and domestic politics at a harsh level in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bedirhanoglu.
Thank you. Thank you, Asli. I would like to provide a perspective on the Kurdish movement and what the election results mean for the Kurds of Turkey. I'll try to make 4 points if possible. My first point relates to the general framework of my argument. There is now a sprint toward normalization. The sense of urgency seems to have dissipated, with the exception of the Kurds. President Erdogan and Justice and Development Party have legitimized their undemocratic regime through election cycles. Especially since the early 2000s, they have been betting on political futures, and the main opposition and the people behind it have always mobilized with hope. With all its shortcomings, the feeling has always been this time it will be different. Now, after the elections, with the exception of the Kurdish movement and the radical left or socialist groups allied with it, everyone is ready to move on. It feels like the stages of grief, and suddenly we have reached to the stage of acceptance. The main opposition, victorious parties, the president, international public opinion, the markets, they all have returned to the daily routine. Life goes on, but perhaps not for the Kurds. For the Kurds and the Kurdish movement, it's a question of existence. House raids that began before the elections to detain Kurdish journalists, activists, and politicians continue, and serious torture is reported during the raids. This brings me to my second point. Given the gravity of the situation for Kurds, the Kurdish and leftist alliance is the only political movement that came up with a sincere self-criticism after the election. The co-chairs of the People's Democratic Party said that they will leave their positions, not run again, and initiate a discussion platform to reflect on what went wrong on their behalf. Joining the coalition to oust Erdogan was the right thing to do for Kurds, but they fell short in operational matters, especially and the narrative. Things like deputy nomination processes were criticized. Politicians and intellectuals identified the main problem as a problem of detachment with their base, especially working class and lower middle class Kurds. The Kurdish movement is historically a ground-up movement. Its political power doesn't stem from the electoral cycles. So a strategy, not just to listen to their base, but also to transform and mobilize the base is key here. In overall, there's an interclass alliance under the Kurdish identity, but historically its roots are leftist, socialist. So democratic autonomy, eco-socialism, gender emancipation are foundational principles of the Kurdish movement. So the self-criticism process will bring about these foundational principles, perhaps move these principles to the core. And my third point is that Kurds anticipate a total attack on their political existence. Erdogan's new cabinet is seen as composed of hawks, and some people also expect military operations now. The Turkish government and Erdogan would also like to transform the Kurds into a right-wing conservative community. On the other hand, they might continue on the one hand, they might continue to contain, intimidate, and eliminate the Kurdish political movement by using different means: intimidation through courts, detainment, torture, potential military operations, attacks by means of paramilitary forces. But we cannot know how harsh it will be. Nevertheless, we will continue to see serious human rights violations. Incarceration has been a main tool so far, but we're going to see multiple new tools introduced. On the other hand, it seems like Erdogan and his new cabinet will also try to contain the Kurdish political movement with right-wing implants and other right-wing religious movements. We will also see serious right-wing attacks on the narratives of the Kurdish movement. So for Kurds, it will be also a matter of political survival. And my final point is about the future possibilities, what to do. Whatever route the Kurds take, it's going to be an arduous one. Next election cycle, we have local elections upcoming, and I would like to remind that Kurds have been having unprecedented electoral victories in local elections since 1999. In all the elections since then, in 2004, 2009, 2014, 19, Kurds won municipalities in Kurdish cities with overwhelming majority. Right before the government appointees process was initiated, the Kurdish political party had 102 municipalities. But what happened is that after the following the failed military coup in 2016, with the state of emergency, almost all of the mayors and majority of the municipal parliament members were removed from their positions. They were imprisoned. And even without proper indictment, and then this continued again after the 2019 elections, again in which Kurds had electoral victories in these municipalities. So even if Kurds do mobilize for their best, their victories, the victory is going to be stolen through the means of trusted appointed trustees. And this is a serious thing that should be taken into consideration, because if we think about the what if question, what if Kurds, like Kurdish municipalities, were still operational? What if all of these people were not imprisoned? I think there wouldn't be much room left for the nationalist narrative, because most of these municipalities are also role models for the rest of the country. So my final point, the final comment, Kurdish movement is resilient, but there's only so much pressure they can bear. So I think it's going to be a gloomy period for Kurds, and they will engage in serious self-criticism, but there are also like structural limitations on what they can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Professor Celik.
Hi everyone, thanks for organizing this event and also our dear attendees, thanks for being here. I will actually briefly talk about the local context of the elections, and the literature argues that local elections and having local mayoral seats provide opposition parties to build credibility, and if they can show the people that they can manage large cities, especially in the Turkish case, metropolitan municipalities, then they can have a higher chance of success in the national politics. Even though there is frustration with the election results, however, people are being emotional, and mostly it's ignored that the AKP actually witnessed a loss in its votes as a party, not as an alliance. As an alliance, as you can see here, it actually very slightly increased its total vote. However, the reason people are frustrated because they feel that the opposition is not successful enough, take advantage of the situation, so the losses of the incumbent are not sufficient. And of course, the frustration also led to calls for renewal of the cadres of the opposition party. Here you can see the results for Istanbul 2018 general elections to 2023. Actually, the CHP on the shown in red actually managed to increase its vote share, while the AKP witnessed a slight loss. That is why Ekrem İmamoğlu is now, who is currently the mayor of Istanbul, is thought to be one of the potential candidates to lead the main opposition CHP. There are actually, yesterday they had a meeting with Kılıçdaroğlu, and the local elections approaching, which will take place next year. So it is reported that he asked Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu to resign and let him lead the change in the main opposition, CHP, so that there would be a new leadership before the local elections. But Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu resisted this, and the current leadership will also carry the party to the forthcoming local elections. So it is also rumored that if İmamoğlu is satisfied with the CHP, he will establish a new political party. So in the coming days, we can expect some resignations from the CHP, some new faces maybe, but again, as one of the participants put in the question box, there's not much change apart from Tuncay Özkan being removed from office after the first round. Kılıçdaroğlu is actually trying to strengthen his base to avoid suffering from inter-party rivalry. Ankara, Mansur Yavaş was also one of the candidates for the vice presidential position. In Ankara, we can see a larger increase in CHP's vote share. This is interesting, and certainly Mansur Yavaş played a role in this outcome. When we look at other cities, Adana, for example, we again see an increase in the votes, and Antalya, we can again witness an increase in CHP's vote share. Mersin, which is actually known for its nationalist sensitivities, still, despite the propaganda of the AKP, still voted for the CHP at a higher rate. And Hatay is an interesting case, and CHP officials must certainly focus on Hatay, because Hatay is one of the metropolitan municipalities under a CHP mayor. And When we compare its vote share in 2018 to 2023 to the latest elections, we can see a decrease in its vote share. It can be due to the specific conditions imposed by the earthquake. Lots of people, had to relocate, unfortunately, after their homes were devastated. But also, it may be a sign of dissatisfaction with the local government in the area. So the party officials should focus more on this. Kocaeli, an AKP stronghold for many years, actually AKP witnessed slight losses. And Bursa, for example, it's one of the strongholds and one of the fifth most populous city in Turkey. It is also, we can see, decreases. Trabzon, Ekrem İmamoğlu's hometown, and CHP is not much popular in Trabzon, but still it was possible to increase its vote share in the province. Konya, of course, an AKP stronghold, but even there we can see a decrease and a slight increase in CHP's vote shares. I will talk about the case of Diyarbakır, Van, and Mardin. These are metropolitan municipalities where they had actually mayors after the 2019 elections from the HDP, People's Democracy Party, but caretaker mayors were appointed by the government, and currently their metropolitan municipal councils don't even function. They cease to exist because of the special clause of the specific law change with a state of emergency decree. So the local politics was taken out of the HDP's and new left party's hands. Their officials cannot convene anymore unless it is called to meeting by the caretaker mayor. We see that the AKP managed to increase its vote share, but this is an interesting trend in three of the cities, Diyarbakır, Van, and Mardin. CHP, even though very slightly, managed to increase its vote share, as we can see here, to 76,000. And also in Mardin, we can see a similar trend, even though still very small in total share, but there's an increase in CHP's votes. If we consider HDP and YSP as same political parties for the purpose of this chart, of course they are different political parties, but we can see that there are some decreases, but still they managed to consolidate their voter base. I will very briefly talk about the new cabinet. It has started to become like a tradition. First Hulusi Akar and now Yaşar Güler appointing former chiefs of staff to the position of Secretary of Defense. This is an interesting process. We had a similar thing in the 1990s with Doğan Güreş, who was appointed as Minister of Defense by the Çiller government, but he had done it after his retirement and taken part in the elections, not while he was still wearing the uniform and resigning in the morning and being appointed as Minister of Defense in the afternoon. About Hakan Fidan, who is appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs now and who was the former head of the Turkish intelligence service. He was already leading negotiations with Egypt. There are also with Syria. There are low-level negotiations. And after the elections, after Erdogan's victory became certain, the leader of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, made a phone call and congratulated Erdogan on his election victory. And both countries very recently expressed their will to appoint ambassadors to each other's capital. Currently, the relations are at the Charge d'Affaires level. So we can see a maybe swifter increase in the reconciliation process between Turkey and Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Balaban.
Thank you very much, Professor Bali. And thank you very much for this opportunity. So I would like to briefly talk about what the opposition in Turkey can do, like within the coming years. So I believe many people in the opposition right now feel desperate in Turkey now. Many feel that whatever they have done to overcome the Islamist government for the last 2 decades basically have failed. They feel that they ran out of options. And I believe our job as scholars now is to sort of thinking about what else the opposition can do in the future and offer some sort of a strategy, at least provide some sort of a context for such a discussion to start. And I also believe we should go beyond the descriptive assessments here. Right now, it's not, of course, we should understand and discuss what's going on in Turkey, but again, we should sort of take the next step. And I, again, believe that the only remaining feasible option for the opposition in Turkey now is basically to adopt a socialist strategy to directly ally with the working class of Turkey. Before I substantiate this argument or try to substantiate this argument, let me first go over what the opposition has done since the early 2000s. First of all, the opposition or some sections of the opposition basically worked on non-democratic methods. For instance, the secularists tried to facilitate a secularist coup in the 2000s. Later, in the mid-2010s, basically there was a coup attempt joined or organized by a specific Islamist clique, allegedly, who are known as the Gülenists, the supporters of Fethullah Gülen. This attempt, luckily failed. And there were also a series of democratic protests, throughout this 20 years. The epitome of this, this street protest was happened in 2013. Known as the Gezi protest, that also failed. And there was also a party alliance which basically built up, in the early 2010s. It's almost right now, a decade old, and the last election basically proved that, this party strategy did not work out to basically just deliver the intended results. In other words, all of these methods failed to dethrone the Islamist clique of Erdogan, while they also showed that the critical element of the political crisis in Turkey is not the Islamist secularist tension or the tension between the Islamists and the secularists. To repeat, another Islamist clique allegedly attempted a coup in 2016, number one. Number two, the Nation Alliance, in other words, the main opposition alliance, had Islamist parties in its own body. Why did these strategies fail? Because they missed the main factor that kept the Islamist government resilient. That factor has been discussed in the literature, but with an eclectic perspective. I believe we should prioritize that factor, and that factor which made Erdogan's clique so resilient is its alliance with export-oriented manufacturing, small and medium-sized enterprises or SMEs. There are over 400,000 SMEs all over the countries. Most of them are located in Istanbul, though, not in small towns. They play a growing role in the production relations of Turkey since the 1990s. Their role in economic relations became more prominent since Islamists came to power. Now, let me share a graph very quickly. This graph illustrates the growing share of the SMEs vis-a-vis the big business during the AKP government. After 2002, when the AKP came to power, the largest 500 industrial enterprise of the country accounted for more than half of the industrial value added and roughly 10% of industrial labor force. As you see, these companies lost their share vis-a-vis the SMEs afterward. Now, these largest 500 companies lost their share vis-a-vis the SMEs, and they account only for less than 15% of the manufacturing value added and roughly 5% of the manufacturing workforce. Now, with Professor Bali, I had 5 minutes, right? Okay, then let me jump to what is to be done very quickly. So, first of all, as almost all of the democratic and undemocratic options failed, the only remaining alternative to me is to move to the left. Second, the Islamists, given the Islamist underbelly is the SME owners, the strategy I believe should focus on the organization of production cooperatives or social enterprises. This way, I believe the opposition can create a platform where they can break the echo chambers in the working class neighborhoods and directly reach out to the workers. And my last point, I believe the socialists as well as the Democrats, not only in Turkey, but also in the North Atlantic countries, discuss how they can contribute to this sort of strategy, as most of these prospective production cooperatives and social enterprises at some point will seek to find a place in global retail chains, especially those based on the notion of fair trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Balaban. I did not mean to rush you. I don't know if you wanted to take, you still have an extra minute or so if you wanted to take it, but.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Bal, for this opportunity. I'm basically just, I think the only point I need to emphasize at this point is the fact that, like the ultimate failure of the opposition for these last two decades has been a consequence of its failure to reach out to the working class, especially in the urban centers of Turkey, who basically, as I said, have been living in this echo chamber, conditioned by first the Islamists and second by the SME owners. So that's why, regardless of what you say, what you tell them on social media, on conventional media, etc., that message is practically not delivered to the voters. So that's why the AKP has been able to keep some sort of a support above 40% in each election for the last 2 decades. That's exactly why, even though I sincerely appreciate all of the discussions about, for instance, the effect of the nationalist rhetoric in this last election, this, for instance, racist attitude, homophobic attitude of the Islamists in this last election, they sort of explain what I would call the margin, the 10% margin, which is important to determine the election results, yes, but at the end of the day, regardless of what they do, the Islamists still would be able to keep that kind of the support, for roughly 40% of the support, which is closely related to the support of the, again, urban working class in Turkey. Thanks again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Professor Yenigun, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Asli, for the generous introduction, and Mimi for organizing the event, and for the attendees for being here with us. I want to discuss, I will try to discuss finally, like the implications of these elections for Turkey's democracy. I want to first reiterate the point from the first round that I made. Yes, the opposition lost in these elections, but the opposition lost in unfree and unfair elections. And further, we are not sure about, completely sure about the election integrity. What do we know is that like a significant number of the polling stations did not have the opposition parties' poll watchers. So the number is 17,000 out of 200,000. So we don't know whether they would change the result or not. And perhaps the only silver lining in these elections about Kılıçdaroğlu was that, for the opposition, was that Kılıçdaroğlu gained 48% of the vote, and this was a first for the opposition. So this is significant because we can't take it for granted that like all the opposition parties would vote would endorse the opposition party member, but in this case, this happened. They were able to gather a coalition to support this kind of a big voter base. And we could also like remember that if 1.2 million voters shifted their votes from the Erdogan to Kılıçdaroğlu, he would win. So this is not like a long shot. This wasn't a long shot, and this was close. And given that these were unfair and unfair elections, we could still see this as a partial success. And the opposition was basically larger than itself in terms of democracy. It was a coalition for democracy. And this was despite the fact that Kılıçdaroğlu for the second round pandered to the basic instincts of the voters about anti-refugee sentiments, and especially with the support of the Victory Party, the Ultranationalist Party. Kılıçdaroğlu deviated from this democratic path a little bit, but despite that, we could still say that in the end, institutionally, this vote would mean restoration of democracy for Turkey. So the significance of these elections for democracy was, in my opinion, was that this was a test case for whether an electoral autocracy or a competitive authoritarian regime could be defeated in unfair elections. So whether Turkey would be able to restore democracy in these elections was the test case in these elections. So this did not happen, and the opposition could not win, and the electoral autocracy could not be defeated with these, and this was another failure. So people compare it with Brazil, but we could remember that Brazil is still a democracy, and people also compare it with Hungary, and the opposition was also united and could not win, but Hungary was also partially free in terms of the Freedom House statistics. So the opposition, despite against all odds, they have proven resilient since the last elections from 2018, and they still were able to gather a coalition. But again, like a point that I made last time, this resilience in a certain paradoxical way also gave the facade of competitiveness and the facade of democracy and legitimacy for the regime. So the question to be seen for the future of Turkey is whether the regime is going to consolidate from now on, because we should also remember that apart from the nature of elections, since 2017, with the controversial referendum, we have an executive presidential regime, which doesn't have checks and balances or separation of powers, and the president is ruling by decree and appointing most of the state bureaucracy without even any consent by the parliament. Parliament is basically ineffective in this regime. So the question to be seen is whether the opposition will prove resilient until the next election and could still keep this coalition. The odds are, not in favor of the opposition. They are already embroiled in internal rifts at this point. So this is a healthy dose of discussion at some point, but if this proves more fragmentary, then the opposition may not be able to keep up the fight. The other option, of course, would be like Erdogan consolidating the regime and suspending even the facade of elections. And also the other option could be like Erdogan trying to change the two-term rule to remain there forever. And he already said that, like we had said that we are not going to be we are going to be here until the grave, is what he said. And the last point that I want to make is we also have to see how the international support of the regime would be. And with the inauguration ceremony, we already saw that NATO could continue with the appeasement strategy, and also the US could also continue with the appeasement strategy, which would give the regime a lease of life. And at this point, the only option for Turkey to restore democracy could be, apart from what Utku said in terms of the class structure, to keep up the fight for the opposition and to keep a certain coalition of democratic opposition still up and running. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. A great round of opening comments. And now we have still about a little more than half an hour to engage with questions. And we have one, as you've already noted, from the audience, but I'm going to still start with a kind of round of questions, of which I have so many. And one, maybe I'll start where Professor Yenigun ended, which is how much, and I'm going to ask a series of questions, and anyone can choose to answer whichever one that they're most interested in, or just none of them, as your interests dictate. But one thing that is striking is the shambolic response on the election day and the immediate aftermath of the election of the opposition, failing to show up at night, long silences, inability to explain what's happening, terrible messaging. And then, as several of you pointed out, this defeated resignation, short message at the end of it. And it's not, it would be one thing if this was the first time, but this is actually a repeat pattern, which is very disturbing, which is highly demobilizing, obviously, for those that are supporters. But it has one other curious feature, which is a sort of defeat in advance of any criticism of how the election itself was conducted. So we know, for example, as exactly as Professor Yenigun said, that there were, maybe as much as nearly 20,000 ballot boxes that did not have opposition witnesses present. We know that there were claims from the YSP that there were as many as 1,000 ballot boxes where there were very substantial irregularities, where votes were miscounted in favor of the ultranationalist party in the coalition with the AKP. We know that there was massive voter intimidation in the Southeast, demobilization of voters, armed people at polling stations. It goes on. And yet, for whatever reason, this accounting does not get undertaken by the opposition. And I wonder if any of you have a sense of what is the strategy that fails to address this degree of open manipulation when, again, as was just pointed out, the actual margin of victory, whatever the percentages say, is 1 million and change. It's really radical. Even the fact that, for example, of dropping an objection to pursuing this, what amounts to a third term, on the constitutional argument that this is merely a second term because of the change of constitutional order, and therefore Erdogan, who is technically supposed to be constrained under the constitution to 2 terms, manages to pursue a third term on an at best questionable constitutional interpretation of how many terms he's actually been in office, et cetera. Why are none of these things meaningfully contested? Why are these strategies a political calculation? It seems, part of a narrative that also lends to legitimizing by failing to critique all the deep illegitimacy of even what remains supposedly competitive in this highly tilted landscape is, I think, a kind of defeat in advance that I can't understand. And so it's both what is the degree of fraud, but the failure to investigate that meaningfully. Okay, second line of questioning. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu seems to be engaging in some moves, perhaps due to his competition at the moment with Ekrem İmamoğlu, which themselves bespeak a kind of authoritarian approach rather than a democratic approach in his own organization internally of the CHP. Why all of a sudden are, the local government offices attached to the office of the leader in the CHP political party? In other words, how is he consolidating his attempt to control and shore up his own flank in anticipation of local elections? And what does this tell us about the direction that the opposition party is likely going to take at a time, as many of you have pointed out, when the YSP is engaging in a very serious internal critique of leadership directions and mistakes made in the run-up to the election? Why are we not seeing openly within the CHP? Of course, we're seeing within the 6 parties of the table of 6, but within the CHP itself, what's happening? If any of you have thoughts on both Kılıçdaroğlu's attempt to shore up his position, unwillingness to cede the leadership there, Ekrem İmamoğlu's perhaps response to that, and all of this in anticipation of, I don't want to engage in a politics of forget the past election, let's look for municipal elections. But it is clear that in the municipal elections, Erdogan will have a score to settle in Istanbul, possibly also in Ankara, but certainly in Istanbul, which for him is a very personal set of scores to settle. And so he will have a particular strategy. I would predict that strategy would include continuing to keep the lira inflated, at least through the spring of 2024, seeking the external support of the Russians and the Saudis and the UAE and Qatar and others to enable that strategy. I think he will also pursue a pretty anti-migrant strategy, at least in the short term, to appeal to urban citizens that are themselves expressing this kind of reactionary politics. And I think that there is likely going to be an attempt to present some kind of so-called orthodoxy. We've already heard this from Mehmet Şimşek about economics, to avoid the flight of foreign direct investment in order, again, to appeal to the bourgeoisie, essentially in Istanbul, to back the AKP as a party of economic stability. I think all of this will be with a view to upcoming local elections. Against this obvious set of scripts that are likely going to be pursued, how is the CHP's failure to reckon? What are the internal politics of Kılıçdaroğlu's attempt to consolidate his position? What do they tell us about lessons that are not being learned, or perhaps other lessons that are being learned? On the Kurdish front, another round of questions. Some have commented that this, cabinet has 3 Kurdish members in it, between the vice president and Mehmet Şimşek and Hakan Fidan. Plus, people have said, well, Ibrahim Kalin, maybe not, he's not Kurdish, but he comes from these provinces as well, et cetera. And as I already foreshadowed in my opening comments, it seems to me that perhaps not in advance of local elections, but shortly thereafter, we might see a very serious effort to further repress and demobilize the Kurdish political movement. And Professor Bedirhanoglu's comments suggested exactly the same. But one way I think this could actually happen is by presenting something that is being described as a Kurdish opening. In other words, a new so-called peace process, a new so-called opening, which will be in the hands of the AKP to frame with interlocutors, privileged interlocutors, of course, that are not at all from the YSP or from the actual grassroots movement. And I wonder how you're reading the likely approach to the Kurdish community and Kurdish movement from a political perspective. In other words, how is the AKP going to present this? How will they actually go about this? And what, and how should we even understand? I mean, this is not the first time. I remember very clearly in 2015, again, all this talk of, 4 Kurdish cabinet members and a Zaza member, and et cetera, and some of the same exact people that Mehmet Şimşek and others were also in that 2015 cabinet. And it's just an interesting attempt already that you can see in the pro-government media to present this as a kind of pluralist cabinet in some way that I feel as if is laying the groundwork for a different framing of the Kurdish politics of the AKP. And then finally, given what I've described as a right reactionary, sort of racist nationalist trend that we've seen, I wonder beyond this, what we can expect beyond the municipal elections, how much deeper might this become for the Kurdish community, for the Alevi community, which was confronted with a near exterminationist politics throughout the election campaign period, on my reading, and who supports this, structurally? What is the political economy of this reactionary approach? And so this one maybe is a question, particularly for Professor Balaban. One question I have for this analysis on small and medium enterprises is, you focused on export-oriented businesses, and you mentioned that the West, these are businesses that are trying to get involved in global retail chains. Maybe the West can help assist in some way. How might the West assist on the one hand? And on the other hand, what are the other bases? So one thing that strikes me as not particularly export-oriented is the construction business. And we can see that both the earthquake and its aftermath has led to a kind of whitewashing of that industry and the core elements of it that are around the AKP, but has also inaugurated yet another era of disaster capitalism in which we can anticipate yet again the major cities, all of which were lost by the AKP, as Professor Celik's presentation made clear, certainly in the West, but all major cities except Bursa were either AKP had a massive vote share, or actively, in fact, lost the city altogether. And yet we are on the cusp of a new politics of reconstruction of cities, I think, that are grounded in the other side of the AKP's political economy, away from export-oriented SMEs, but in the construction industry. And I wonder what role that's going to play. And is this where this reactionary politics finds its home? Like, what's the grassroots base ultimately for this reactionary politics? And okay, so that's a lot. I hope there's something there for everyone. And we're going to do a lightning round of responses, so 2 to 3 minutes each. And you know what, given the time, actually, I should throw in our Q&A question, which I think many of you have read. One of which is very clearly tied to the question I asked about how should we read recent changes in the main opposition party? So that already converges with a question I've asked. And then the second one is the constitutional question. I agree, and I also foreshadowed this in my own opening comments, that we're very likely to now see a new constitution project. What do you, if any of you have interest in this particular question, what do you anticipate happening here? There's obviously, if the right-wing groups that were participating in the party of the table of 6 end up actually breaking away and supporting such a constitutional referendum, which I think is an easily foreseeable possibility, then maybe we don't even need a referendum. But what can we expect? What kind of charter is the AKP going to be interested in introducing for the new Turkish century? And with that, we'll go in reverse order, if that's okay. And so we will start with Professor Yenigun.
Yeah, these are so many big and tough questions. I don't want to take that much time. I just want to, answer, share my thoughts about the Kurdish issue. So what Nazan said, the phrase that she used, Kurdish political existence, that is the key here. The political existence that Erdogan and the government, the regime, is trying to eradicate at this point. Like token Kurds in the cabinet, or like people who are ethnically Kurd, that doesn't mean much in terms of the discussion of Kurdish issue in Turkey. And what some commentators say about Hüdapar alliance with Hüdapar, is that we are seeing a much larger design by the regime about the Kurds, and a new basically initiative to subdue the Kurdish political will is what we might be able to, what we might see in the near future. And the opposition, of course, must remain vigilant about that, and must remain in solidarity with the Kurdish political will, as it was the critical, basically, support for Kılıçdaroğlu's presidential bid. That is the only point I want to make, and I will leave the rest to other friends. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Balaban.
Thank you very much, Professor Bali. First of all, I also raised my hand because, I would like to say a couple of things about this this new policy of the CHP, CHP's new policy about municipalities. While I was serving for the CHP in 2017 and in 2018, one of the most prominent urban sociologists who was also working for the party was working on a project that would connect, let's say, the databases of the CHP municipalities to the party headquarters. So then, the party headquarters could sort of coordinate the activities of the parties, because CHP basically currently controls over 200 municipalities, which basically accounts for a big portion of the Turkish economy. And there was so much, let's say, resistance against the idea. I mean, finally, basically, it did not become popular, among the top leadership of the party. Now we see, a reversal of this policy. I just wanted to emphasize, let's say, how important this is, for the CHP, because if you take, let's say, the municipalities away from the CHP's hands, and everything would just, change. Also, like I said, there's always a power dynamic between the municipalities and the headquarters, the CHP headquarters. And also about this question posed by Ahmet Özgürler. So, the new, let's say, leadership, the new MESA, the Central Decision Planning Committee, is basically composed of, people who are very close, let's say, to Kılıçdaroğlu. So Bülent Kuşoğlu, Faik Öztürk, they were already there. Lale Hanım, for instance, Lale Karabıyık, just, was there. So he left the position for a while and then came back. Yunus was already there. Zeynel Emre was some deputy. So, in sort of, let's say, one of the very reliable team, for Kılıçdaroğlu. Now let me come back, to your questions, very briefly. So I didn't take time to keep the time. So please stop me if I just speak too long. So how can the West help? Now, of course, we do not have this kind of a project right now in Turkey. But if people just choose to take this kind of a direction, and if the project at least partially succeeds, then let's say people in the North Atlantic basically just will be given an option. Are you going to buy the products from this let's say sweatshops in Turkey, which basically exploit the workers as well as let's say undermine the Turkish democracy, or would you buy, let's say, your products from Turkey that just are coming from this production places controlled by the workers. So like this is the idea. How about the construction industry, which is basically heavily domestic, in terms of its, there's both supply and there's both in terms of its input and in terms of the market. Really, construction industry has been historically everywhere. Basically supplied by, let's say, domestic, like other domestic industries such as cement industry, such as brick production, etc., etc. Having said that, the growth of the construction industry has been historically closely tied to the growth of the manufacturing industries in Turkey. As a matter of fact, let's say the money just accumulated in this, like sweatshop or by the sweatshop owners, SME owners, have been heavily invested in the construction industry because they just do not have the human capital to just invest, all this accumulated, let's say, profits in another industry. In big cities, we see
30 more seconds.
3 seconds. Okay, then I'll just, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I had said 30, sorry, I'm not being very clear today, but anyway. Okay, Professor Chi.
Thank you. For the opposition, for the CHP, actually, they failed in their communication strategy in 2018 as well. That's the second time, as Professor Bali mentioned. The election night, they had difficulties again, this time getting data from the polls in different parts of the country, despite their claims that they built a very reliable system that will allow the documents which contain signatures, ıslak imzalı sandık tutanakları, the documents about the results of the counting in polls. This failed, and Anka agency, which is associated with Tunca Özkan, failed, and Tunca Özkan was removed from his place overnight. But the trouble is that the party should develop its touch in a better way with the grassroots. And to do this, I'm specifically talking about CHP, the party must start using the mechanisms of internal democracy. It's not just the top leadership, it's the delegates of the party who vote in the Congress, the Kurultay. But how these people are selected to these positions, that's also another problem. And like other parties, many other parties in Turkey, they are leader-oriented, and there are no primaries, for example, for the candidate selection, and this is totally undemocratic for a party that is claiming to, support democracy in Turkey. First, the party itself must start using democratic principles inside itself as an organization. Of course, there will be too much discussion, I believe, about the forthcoming local elections. People may want a new leadership, and this is not the first time Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu lost, despite everything we said about the authoritarian structure of the regime, but they may ask for a new leadership. On the other hand, this may debate about leadership and maybe a Kurultay, a Congress of the party, may paralyze the party right before the local elections. So the process will be tough for the main opposition, CHP. But AKP certainly wants to regain the metropolitan municipalities of Istanbul and Ankara, and Istanbul is key. A few days ago, journalist Saygı Öztürk claimed that they were going to appoint caretaker mayors to CHP metropolitan municipalities, but then they thought it would backfire because there was not much time left for the local elections, so they gave up the idea. But anytime, depending on the political situation, that may happen. So CHP must change, but we will see how this change will take shape in the coming months. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Professor Bedirhanoglu.
Thank you so much for this, for the wonderful questions. There are so many points to touch upon, but I'll just take the Kurdish question that you posed. So in terms of having Kurdish ministers, Erdogan used this point for the international audience before, as you mentioned, and then when he faced with criticisms of criminalizing or excluding Kurds, and he used this example that I have Kurds in my cabinet, but it might look sympathetic to outsiders, to international audience, but I don't think it's well received by politically oriented Kurds who unite behind the Kurdish freedom movement, because I think the terms that we might find useful here are systematic racism and colonialism. When we're thinking about the Kurdish question in Turkey. So this is one of the main points. Also, the Kurdish movement can read the political scene better than other parties in opposition, I believe, due to the distance they have with the state forces and years of confrontation and manipulation. So if there were, let's say, a new opening, as you mentioned, and some people anticipate this, I think that it won't look like the one before, in terms of like there won't be a ceasefire with the Kurdish armed movement. It would rather be like go hand in hand with military operations, and the Erdogan regime will continue to criminalize the Kurdish movement, the political movement. However, this time they won't make the mistake that they made last time. They will choose to have a new kind of maybe peace process opening with their own agents that they selected. So I think like these might be implants. They might try to contain the Kurdish political movement, especially now that we know there's this Kurdish religious party supported by Erdogan. So it won't look the same as before. That's one of the main points that I would like to make. And it's also the conditions are not the same either, right? Like think of the changes that are ongoing in northeastern Syria, and also the international audience, the support that Kurds received in mid 2010s from international actors is not there anymore. So taking all of these into consideration, even if there was a new peace process, I think Kurds will be better trained this time not to take the arguments at their face value. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Altinkas.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to focus on your first question, which was about the silence of the opposition at on the election night in 2018 and in the last elections as well. There is something I believe the North American public opinion is missing regarding the Turkish government party and its supporters. There have been ongoing threats by the supporters of the ruling party and Erdogan on social media, on some TV channels. Even the minister of, Süleyman Soylu even himself said that we are not going to leave the country to them. This was a very open language. And in 2018 elections, when Muharrem İnce lost the presidential election, we have witnessed thousands of AKP supporters, Erdogan supporters on the streets, shooting in the air, weapons, guns in their hands. So any case of potential explanation or statement by the opposition leader on the night of May 28, mentioning to their audience or voters that, there are still ongoing, we are still counting the votes. There are 17,000 ballot boxes that could not be reached, etc. This would provoke the people, and we don't know what will happen. This is something we are missing, and I just wanted to mention it for the records. The second thing I really believe important is that the Turkish government has been constructing more than 1 million houses and apartments in northern Syria. They have clearly stated this, and no one focuses. When I look at the domestic politics, no one focused on this, but I believe this has very long-term implications regarding the Syrian refugees or Syrians living in Turkey today. Why would a government construct 1 million houses in northern Syria, which is a very contested zone between the Turkish military and YPG. So this is also an important topic, and we should also think about this when we talk about the Kurdish politics within Turkey and the future of the refugees in Turkey. And this is something that will probably shape the future of the country in the very short term. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Professor Gumrukcu.
Yeah, a lot to unpack, right? And I don't know what else to add to the discussion. But I was also thinking, like regarding your question on the opposition, Asli, I was thinking, like in the post-1980 period, right? Especially, masses has been detached from politics in the country. And clearly Turkey is not a movement society in terms of, like Taros and his colleagues' definition. So using the streets as a venue for political participation is not a normalized thing. And this is not only valid for the more conservative right-wing parties, but also valid for, like the mainstream center-left parties like the CHP. And I agree with you that, like back in 2018, the CHP kind of disappointed their followers with their lack of response to the election results. But I will suggest, like this goes actually back to the 2017, with the constitutional referendum. If you would remember, like back at the time, during the very referendum, the government changed the rules of the game at the very moment when the voting was still continuing. And there were a lot of protests that happened that night. And while the CHP leader Kılıçdaroğlu said that, like everyone should protest this decision and the outcome of the referendum, they as a political party did not go out on the streets. What happened was that instead, a few weeks later only, Kılıçdaroğlu started his own, like Adalet Yürüyüşü, Justice March. So I also believe that this is kind of like the part of the general culture of seeing only going to the ballot boxes as the legitimate way of doing politics, but also the institutional, like transformation the CHP went through since Kılıçdaroğlu's chairmanship since 2010, if I'm not mistaken. So I think the party became like a more catch-all type of party, and the leader, Kılıçdaroğlu, adopted a more personalized leadership style, I believe. And I think, like the Justice March was an implication of this. And also, like his running as a presidential candidate in the last elections. And I believe this is kind of a bit, sad for representative politics, because when you look at it, the data suggests that already about like 60% of the population do not trust in political parties. So I believe, like this electoral cycle is going to probably, like increase that amount of people who doesn't trust in parliamentary and party politics. But still, I'm hopeful in the more popular opposition, which quite highly mobilized even during this election cycle too.
We have a few minutes left. If there are additional comments anybody would like to make, I did want to underscore a couple of silver linings that emerged from the discussion, including, despite slightly lower turnout in the second round, there was actually remarkably high turnout once again in the second round. So enormous willingness to engage and be mobilized, at least for ballot boxes of the population. The fact that the AKP as a party lost in so many cities. So that's the increase in the vote share, as many of you said, of the opposition candidate, even if not sufficient to win, is still a remarkable historically amount of the vote share for someone who's presented as a supposed center-left candidate. And there are maybe a couple of other things that could be noted. For example, for a very long time, Turkish politics was dramatically distorted by the electoral threshold. Electoral threshold has stopped mattering in some ways. There are other distortions that were introduced, favoritism to the largest party in parliament, as an example. But the AKP is, while the largest party in parliament, a party that has lost substantial vote share. And although the smaller parties have entered into parliament through a set of opposition strategies that are now, I think, in retrospect, somewhat questionable, whether or not it made sense to enter into this transpartisan coalition, whether all 6 of these parties belonged at the table and belonged on the lists. Nonetheless, you now have formal parties, a much larger number of formal parties represented that competed as parties in this election for parliament than ever before, because basically the election threshold has ceased to matter under this new logic of coalitions in a way that, and was moreover was reduced regardless, both reduced and has ceased to matter in quite the same way. So there are some, at least interesting political developments one might note that are not entirely depressing, even if the next 5 years hardly suggests a democratic trajectory. But I would like to leave the last word to any panelists who might want to say anything in closing, if there's anyone. And if not, then maybe I will just thank all of you. So of course, we've recorded this. These are now a pair of panels that I think offer us an incredibly rich array of perspectives and just different angles on how to interpret over a longue durée. I mean, looking now from our first panel, which engaged not only the outcome of May 14th, but the process that led up to May 14th, and then how to think about May 28th. And now this panel, which really rounds out the analysis by not only digesting our understanding of May 28th, but also helping us think moving forward, what strategies, where can we find hope? What strategies may still exist? What are likely sources of opposition resilience? What are directions, new directions, particularly with respect to class politics that ought to be pursued and a socialist trajectory, at least for some proportion of the opposition. So we have had an incredibly rich conversation, which we'll now have archived and posted. We're very grateful for the support of Georgetown and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, as well as Jadaliya, Arab Studies Institute, and MESA Global Academy for creating this platform, and to all of you, above all, for being willing to come back and speak with us a second time and have this analysis available for a broad public as a recording. So thank you so much, and thanks to all who joined us, and to the many others I'm sure who are going to watch us in recording and get the benefit of your perspective. Bye to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Bye.